Now, manufacturing chips on U.S. soil is a growing priority amid mounting geopolitical tensions between China and Taiwan. The CHIPS Act set aside more than $52 billion for reshoring production.
These actually have billions and many billions of memory bits that store information in ones and zeros in them.
New fab that we're building in Boise, Idaho right now that we're just poured concrete on in October will be over 600,000 square feet. So over 12 times of the size that you see behind me.
ARM is the most pervasive CPU or brain in the history of modern electronics.
I mean, Texas is spacious, it's huge, and then it has great support for ease of business.
Because we have ports, because we have access to materials, because of our low cost of doing business, we're best situated to lead this next generation of chip manufacturing.
These actually have billions and many billions of memory bits that store information in ones and zeros in them.
Data is at the center of all our devices and generative AI, and accessing and storing that data requires these memory chips. And there's only one major memory maker based in the US.
Micron, the maker of basic DRAM chips, the building blocks of all memory.
Micron's stock is up more than 30% since the start of the year, largely thanks to generative AI hype. And while memory is a simpler, cheaper type of semiconductor than the high-powered central processing units and graphics processing units sending other chip stocks through the roof, multiple memory chips are needed to support each GPU or CPU. And that means making memory takes more space than other kinds of chips.
The new fab that we're building in Boise, Idaho right now that we're just poured concrete on in October will be over 600,000 square feet. So over 12 times of the size that you see behind me. In addition to that, in New York, we're going to build 4 of those 600,000 square foot fabs for a total of 2.4 million square feet.
At $100 billion over 20 years, Micron's investment in 4 chip fabrication plants, or fabs, in upstate New York is slated to be the biggest U.S. chip project in history. It's a commitment Micron made with some big help from New York and a bid for National CHIPS Act funding.
We have to make it worth their while. It's still a competitive environment. We're competing with the rest of the globe.
But being the only U.S. memory maker also comes with risk. Micron is the latest target of China's bans on U.S. chips, as the two countries vie for technological dominance.
Micron has absolutely become a pawn in what I consider this 15-year war between China and the U.S.
CNBC went to Micron's giant fab in Boise, Idaho, to see the start of its major expansion into advanced memory manufacturing on U.S. soil, and ask how it'll pull off massive growth amid a market oversupply and geopolitical turmoil that's casting doubt on the quarter of its revenue that comes from China. Micron was founded in 1978 by 3 chip engineers and one of their twin brothers in the basement of a dental office in Boise, Idaho. By 1980, it was building its first fab and pumping out a revolutionarily small 64K DRAM chip by 1981. These chips, used for storing bits of data that can be quickly accessed by a CPU, ended up in many of the early personal computers.
So there are 2 main types of memory, DRAM and NAND. DRAM stands for Dynamic Random Access Memory, and it is a volatile memory, which means that when the power is removed, it loses all of its information. It's very fast, and it sits near the CPU, and it's used for real-time processing. NAND flash memory is what's in your SSDs or your storage cards, and NAND flash is non-volatile, meaning it'll still store your memory even when power is removed.
Micron went public in 1984.
Remember our name when choosing your career.
Scott Gatzmeier joined as an intern in 1997.
And at the time, DRAM was worth its weight in gold. This was kind of as the dot-com era was starting to take off, and it was incredibly exciting and something that I wanted to be a part of.
Now he heads up Micron's expansion projects in both New York and Boise, where he gave us a tour.
The features that we build on our NAND and DRAM devices are sub 15 nanometers. Well, a human hair is 3,000 times the size of those devices. So any, hair follicle or dead skin, could cause contaminations to our equipment, our wafers, causing our yield to lower. So this is why we wear the bunny suits and the gowns inside of the fab.
CEO Sanjay Mehrotra says the $15 billion Boise expansion and the 4 fabs in Syracuse, New York are necessary because of how fast the entire memory industry has grown alongside compute and AI.
At the turn of the century, memory used to be about 10% of semiconductors. Today, it varies from 25 to 30% of the total global semiconductor industry revenue. Anything that has compute requires some amount of memory. This trend of AI, memory enables deeper insights, and that makes AI smarter. So as AI gets bigger, memory gets bigger.
Memory used to be a crowded field, but over the years, it's whittled down to just 3 top players.
But the name of the game is high performance and low cost at the same time. Otherwise, you're going to be blasted out of the market. And there used to be 20 memory makers that were out there that were relevant. And really, there's only 3 at this point.
When it comes to the biggest type of memory, DRAM, South Korean giant Samsung is by far the leader in revenue, followed by SK Hynix, also out of Korea, and then Micron in the US. Micron has made 11 acquisitions since 1998.
The Mnemonics, Elpida, Inotera, TI's memory business. For a very long period, they had not invested in a new fab, but they were still able to retain their market share by acquiring other smaller memory firms which were either going out of business, bankrupt.
Unlike most kinds of chips, memory wasn't in short supply during the chip shortage. But Micron and its competitors did see a major upswing during the pandemic-fueled boom in consumer electronics sales. Then Micron's profits fell significantly in 2022 due to weakened demand for PCs and smartphones, a downturn that's affected much of the chip industry. Micron reduced its output to limit oversupply and laid off 10% of its workforce in the beginning of 2023. It now employs some 43,000 people globally.
When I look at this market over the past 30 years, it's always feast or famine. And we have an oversupply now, but guess what? Give it a couple months and we will be in an undersupply.
Micron supplies memory in phones from Apple, Motorola, Asus, and more, and it's optimistic about growth.
The mix of smartphones is going more and more toward higher-end smartphones, toward the flagship smartphones, which require more memory as well. So when we look ahead at 2024, we actually expect that year over year, total worldwide smartphone unit sales will increase.
But Micron is also focused on rapid growth markets like automotive and generative AI. Its most advanced product, high bandwidth memory, is set for volume production next year. HBM helps AI models like ChatGPT remember past conversations and user preferences to generate more human-like responses.
It is able to pack 50% more memory capacity in a memory cube. It is able to give you 50% faster performance and is able to give you about 2.5 times better power and performance efficiency. And these are all the elements that are critically important in AI applications.
Unlike the market-wide headwinds of oversupply and slow device sales, Micron is facing one major challenge that the Korean memory giants have not. China banned some of Micron's sales in May, citing cybersecurity risks.
About 25% of Micron's business revenue comes from China markets, and about half of that revenue is at risk given the CAC decision.
Last year, the US barred chip companies from supplying China with certain key technologies.
Micron is absolutely just a pawn in this game. Right now, they weren't the first, and they were not the last.
Have you become a pawn in this geopolitical chip war between the two countries?
Katie, what I can tell you is that it's very important for US and China to provide an environment to the businesses so that they can invest in a predictable manner. Micron, of course, is totally committed to our customers across various end markets in China.
Meanwhile, Micron has started construction on a $2.75 billion assembly and test facility in India.
So Micron is obviously trying to diversify its base. It has testing and packaging facilities in China, and obviously they are trying to diversify out of China. India has been trying to lure and attract multinational chip makers to set up projects in the country through multiple schemes and projects. And this is the first major one.
For now, Micron is still in China, but China is turning to memory from Samsung, SK Hynix, and smaller Chinese memory makers instead. That's possible because memory is considered a commodity, meaning it's relatively easy to switch between products from different companies, although that's not guaranteed to last.
What I'm going to find really interesting is when we get back to the boom days and Hynix and Samsung can't fulfill all the volumes, you might see China diving back into Micron and suddenly lifting any restrictions.
As for whether Micron's tech does indeed pose a national security risk for China,
I believe it's a front. Compared to a CPU or a GPU or a system, it's pretty hard to embed something nefarious into something like storage or memory. That would be technology that I have never heard of.
We think China was being very nasty about this to Micron.
In October, Schumer led a delegation of senators to visit China for a rare meeting with President Xi, in part to discuss the ban on Micron.
China's upset with the Biden administration's very smart prohibition of selling certain types of chip manufacturing equipment to China. But we're going to stick up for Micron.
This also isn't the first time Micron has been at the center of U.S.-China tensions. In 2018, the U.S. cut ties with Chinese chip company Fujian Jinhua after accusing it of stealing IP from Micron, a claim the Chinese company denied. Micron told CNBC its IP is critical for revenue in the commodity business of memory.
So behind me you see Micron's patent wall, and we have over 54,000 patents. Our primary revenue source is we want to use our IP to manufacture our chips better than others.
The week before Schumer's China visit, Micron marked its 45th anniversary by pouring the first cement for its new Boise fab.
Both Boise and New York will be producing these advanced 300mm wafers with memory technology on them.
The most advanced size wafer in the industry, correct?
In volume production, yes.
Micron's U.S. footprint today includes its headquarters and R&D facility in Boise, a lagging-edge memory fab in Manassas, Virginia, and offices in 5 other states. Its leading nodes are made at fabs in Japan and Taiwan. By 2026, Micron plans to start leading-edge production at the new Boise fab.
And then in our state-of-the-art facility in New York, when it's fully built out, we'll produce over 100,000 wafers per month.
Each of these silicon wafers goes through more than 1,000 steps over 90 days, traveling via automated overhead robotics.
The vehicles that deliver these wafers travel over 23,000 miles annually in our fab.
Memory isn't a high-cost product like logic chips, computing powerhouses like CPUs and GPUs, but that's actually one reason Micron's fabs are even bigger than those needed to make logic.
So memory is very cost sensitive, and we have to get economies of scale to mass produce our chips on a level that meets the market demands.
Another reason the fab is so large is to accommodate huge, expensive machinery, like this $250 million extreme ultraviolet photolithography machine for printing the chip's tiniest features.
So the sheer size of this tool is absolutely massive. There's over 100,000 parts. The tool weighs 20 tons. It has to be delivered on 3 747s, then shipped to us in 40 shipping containers on the back of 20 semis.
EUV machines are only made by one company, ASML in the Netherlands, and they're infamous for taking incredible amounts of power. Micron says each of its new fabs will use the equivalent of 25,000 homes worth of energy.
Renewable, reliable energy is absolutely critical for our fabs. In the US, we have access to that renewable, reliable energy, and the cost of that energy is about 25% of the cost of equivalent energy in Asia.
Many of those 1,000 steps also require a lot of water.
So in New York, we're building 4 600,000 square foot fabs. Each one of those fabs will use 25 Olympic-sized swimming pools worth of water a day. 75% of that water will be reused and recycled right on site.
Water and power were both big reasons why Micron settled on U.S. expansion.
We have an area plus plentiful fresh water, not just the Finger Lakes, but 2 Great Lakes, Lake Erie and Lake Ontario, and low-cost power generated primarily by hydroelectric and wind and solar. So we're ready for it. We know it's going to be a transition.
The energy costs are, interestingly enough, lower in the United States than most parts of the world. People are more expensive in the United States, and so is the materials and the cost to build that factory. But that gap is narrowing over time.
Still, in Arizona, the world's advanced chip leader, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, recently blamed a shortage of skilled labor for delays to its massive $40 billion fab under construction there.
That won't happen in New York because we already have a legacy. We have Wolfspeed, we have Global Foundry, so this is not a new industry to us.
We're attacking this from K through 12 all the way through postgraduate studies. We are big donators to the STEAM School in Syracuse, New York. We also run Chip Camp. In fact, my daughter, she's 13, and she went to the Chip Camp in Boise, Idaho this summer.
Still, the U.S. share of chip manufacturing has plummeted in recent decades. It costs at least 20% more to build and operate a new fab in the U.S. than in Asia. Labor is cheaper there, the supply chain is more accessible, and government incentives are far greater. That's why the CHIPS and Science Act sets aside $52.7 billion for companies to manufacture in the U.S. And it's no surprise that Micron, and more than 460 other companies, have applied for those funds. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer thought up the idea for the CHIPS and Science Act at the gym in 2019, while talking with Republican Senator Todd Young.
And all of a sudden, when it came to chips, so essential to everything we do, we had lost that edge. And if we didn't get back that edge, and not just on chips, but on science broadly, we would no longer be the #1 economic power in the world. Prosperity in America would decrease, the number of jobs would go down. So I felt a passion about this.
The U.S. has especially lost that edge on the memory side of chips. Now, Micron is making big promises about changing that.
Today, only 2% of the world's total memory production, DRAM production, is coming from the US. And all of that comes from Micron's fab in Manassas, Virginia. With Micron's investments through CHIPS support in Boise, Idaho, as well as in Syracuse, New York, that 2% over the course of nearly 20 years will be changing to about 15% of the worldwide production coming from the US.
In New York, Governor Kathy Hochul signed the $10 billion Green Chips Act last summer to entice companies like Micron, which says it's eligible for up to $5.5 billion from the bill.
If they hadn't passed the CHIPS and Science Act first, I don't think it would have been as many as incentives as necessary to bring them home or to encourage existing U.S. manufacturers to continue to expand. So I knew I had to woo them, talk about our incentives, but also, we get out of it 50,000 jobs.
To make good on its promises in New York and Idaho, Micron is betting big that as the world relies more and more on technologies with vast data needs, they'll also need more and more memory.
The large language learning models and other things like that continue to increase large demand. We're now moving into things like FaceTime, higher resolution images, movies on demand. All of that requires more and more memory to be made available.
Micron says construction in New York will begin at the end of 2024, and chip production will start in 2027, with some major promises about what that means for the country's share of memory manufacturing.
10% of Micron production today is produced here in the US. As these projects advance and complete, nearly 60% of Micron's production will be coming over the course of next couple of decades from here in the US.
Every single one of these devices has a chip inside that has the ARM CPU. And that ARM CPU is the brain of that device.
There's a company nearly every chip maker relies on that doesn't actually make anything tangible. Yet its blockbuster IPO in September valued it above $54 billion.
ARM is open for its first trade.
It's the largest public offering in over 2 years, has brought confidence back to the IPO market.
Computer chip maker ARM Holdings getting a nice reception from Wall Street today.
Rather than make chips, the UK-based company designs the architecture, then sells licenses for these instruction sets to companies that make central processing units, or CPUs. What exactly is an architecture?
If you think about the CPU as the brain, those are the instructions, or the commands, if you will, that tell the brain what to do, how to walk, how to run, how to lift an object.
It also collects royalties on every chip shipped with its technology.
ARM is the most pervasive CPU, or brain, in the history of modern electronics. 250 billion of those brains that have shipped in our history. Over 30 billion of those brains ship every single year.
ARM's customers include Apple, NVIDIA, Google, Microsoft, Amazon, Samsung, Intel, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, in short, the world's biggest names in tech and chips.
Most people think about a device. Then maybe if they're really sophisticated, they think about the chip, but they don't think about the company that came up with the original ideas behind how that chip operates. But once you do understand what they do, it's absolutely amazing.
ARM chips are known for using less power than those made with rival x86, the older traditional PC and server architecture used by CPU giants Intel and Advanced Micro devices. Now there's a surge in adoption of ARM. It's the basis for Apple's M series of processors, which have replaced Intel chips in Macs, for Amazon Web Services custom server chips, for Qualcomm's flagship Snapdragon chips that are poised to break into the PC market. And now NVIDIA and AMD are reportedly working on ARM-based PC chips too. But in recent years, ARM has also faced plenty of risks. About 20% of its revenue comes from China. Smartphones, which almost all contain ARM processors, are seeing a major sales slump. And when NVIDIA tried to buy ARM for $40 billion, the deal was blocked by regulators.
That didn't go the way that everyone anticipated or hoped that it would, but the sun comes up the next day, right? And you have to be able to build from that.
CNBC went to ARM in the UK and talked to CEO Rene Haas to find out how it became the year's biggest IPO with so many big-name customers in the face of low smartphone sales and geopolitical uncertainty. ARM was founded in 1990 by 12 chip designers working out of a turkey barn in Cambridge in the UK. It was originally a joint venture between Apple, Acorn Computers, and VSLI, known today as NXP.
The model was always to come up with a core design that we would license to lots of different companies.
Apple launched its early handheld Newton device on the ARM 610 processor in 1993.
Way ahead of its time, ran off a battery, had a display, which kind of goes to what the hallmarks of the company are. We were born running a device off a battery that was going to be low cost. So that was the birth of the company.
For ARM, they received per unit royalty. And they were able to take that money, reinvest it, hire more staff, and grow and expand.
ARM then struck a deal with Texas Instruments, putting its processors in early Nokia mobile phones, beginning ARM's climb to become the dominant architecture in almost all smartphones today.
There's probably 16 to 20 CPUs alone inside the smartphone. And it will do things like recognize your fingerprint, it'll manage the camera, it runs all the applications.
ARM went public for the first time in 1998. Chief architect Richard Grissenthwaite was there.
I joined when we were a much smaller company. We were about 100 people and been very much involved in this tremendous transition that the company's gone through, expanding out from targeting one particular market area into a wide range of different computing environments.
ARM grew rapidly in the 2000s, with the first touchscreen phones introduced in 2007 and the growth of connected home devices in the 2010s. ARM now has some 6,500 employees globally.
About a sixth of our population is in the US, and a lot of very high quality engineering, both architecture and microarchitecture, goes on there. And then we've got a lot of people in the UK, and we've got people also in India and in France and in lots of other places around the world.
In 2016, ARM went private when it was bought by Japan's SoftBank for $32 billion. Now CEO, Rene Haas was president of the IP Products Group at the time, spearheading diversification into emerging markets, including AI.
PC and phone, automotive, data center, and IoT. Every single one of those markets has AI embedded in some way, shape, or form.
Stop. Go.
ARM says it has some 6,800 patents worldwide, with another 2,700 applications pending. Some of those are for ARM's Neoverse line for high performance and cloud computing, which has helped it break into AI since its launch in 2018.
NVIDIA just partnered with ARM on their new Grace Hopper superchip, which is, designed to combine the GPUs of NVIDIA plus the CPUs of ARM. Obviously huge for AI-related things.
That's actually got 72 of our Neoverse cores in it, plus their own big GPUs. By bringing those together and tightly coupling the way that NVIDIA has with the Grace Hopper, they're able to come up with something that's something like 2 to 4 times the performance of what you get on an x86 system for a similar amount of power.
But in 2020, ARM owner SoftBank needed cash. It had lost money on investments in companies like WeWork and Uber, so it struck a deal to sell ARM to NVIDIA for $40 billion. 18 months later, the deal fell apart, blocked by regulators and a consortium of ARM's biggest customers that also compete with NVIDIA.
It was a long process. Disappointed it didn't happen just because we spent so much time on it, but I was very confident whether it happened or it didn't happen, things were going to turn out great for us.
Instead, SoftBank announced plans to take ARM public again, and Haas took over as CEO. ARM made its second public debut on September 14th, climbing nearly 25% that day. It's fallen significantly since then. Although it did beat expectations in its first earnings report, revenue guidance came in lower than expected, sending its stock down 7% in extended trading. ARM makes money in 2 different ways, by selling different kinds of licenses, charging companies a fee to access the ARM technology for building their chips. And you're collecting royalties for each of these chips.
We are, yep.
Any dollar figure you can put on it?
I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but for us, basically, our model is 60% of our revenues come from the royalties and growing. 40% of it comes from our licensing business.
ARM dominates in smartphone processors, but x86 architecture, developed by Intel in the 70s, still leads in computers and server processors. RISC-V is the other main competitor. The free open-source architecture has seen a recent growth in popularity, with backing from some of ARM's big customers like Google, Samsung, and Qualcomm. They may have been seeking alternatives when it looked like NVIDIA was going to buy ARM.
RISC-V sits a few years behind where ARM is at, and I don't think we're going to hear a lot about it right away. I do think in low power, in IoT, in simpler designs, that RISC-V does have some traction.
Rival x86, meanwhile, has more software developed for it than ARM, although that may be changing.
The amount of software support is the thing that actually tends to determine the success or failure of that in the long run. Intel was very good early on with getting a ton of software support for x86. Most servers were x86 based, but what's happened in the server market is that the software has been componentized. It's broken up into containers and things like that, and that makes it easier to run on other architectures like ARM.
ARM's biggest differentiator is lower power consumption, something that's helping ARM break into the laptop market. Apple, for instance, says its ARM-based M3 chips give the newest MacBook Pro up to 22 hours of battery life. Apple's move away from Intel was a big proving point for ARM's ability to diversify beyond smartphones.
Nobody really believed until Apple went all in and basically cut ties with x86 instruction sets and said, we are going to bet the future of the Mac on ARM. And that was a huge inflection for the company. It was a change of the guard. And this isn't to say that Intel's future is in big trouble, but it certainly started to raise some question marks as to, well, if Apple can do it, can others?
In September, Apple extended its deal with ARM through at least 2040. Qualcomm is another major customer making PC processors using ARM, although now ARM is suing Qualcomm over the right to make certain chips with its technology. The issues started after Qualcomm acquired CPU company Nuvia in 2021, and with it, Nuvia's ARM license.
Well, Nuvia was actually supposed to be designing a server chip initially, so they had different terms with them. And so Qualcomm thought they could have the same terms. ARM felt, no, different companies have different terms, and it's boiled down to essentially that legal discussions around what those terms ought to be.
The case is set to go to trial in 2024. And Qualcomm remains committed to introducing ARM-based PC chips on Windows laptops in the next year. On the server side, Amazon Web Services is the big player making ARM-based chips for the data center.
And that was the launch of Graviton. And really from there, ARM went from this mobile, low-power, IoT, automotive, specialty, embedded to, holy cow, we can build next-generation servers, PCs, and of course, continue on this massive run of silicon for smartphones, all based on ARM.
ARM chips have long been in cars, but it's now a rapid growth area with the rise of self-driving capabilities.
And actually, it's one of the most computationally intensive tasks we've ever seen on this planet in terms of mass deployment of it. And what we need to provide is a standard platform to allow the world's software developers to really concentrate on this incredibly hard task going forward. And for this reason, we've developed the AVA development platform, which we're showing here, which consists of 32 of our Neoverse cores.
ARM is also seeing growth due to a trend of non-chip companies like Amazon and Apple turning to ARM to design their own custom silicon, allowing them to depend less and spend less on historic chip giants.
Gone primarily from companies who that's all they did, to companies like Microsoft and Apple and others who are now adding chip design as just a piece of their business, which means, they've got a smaller team than entire companies built on that. And so you have to make that process easier and simpler. And that, for example, is where ARM is starting to move in terms of enabling the design of multiple components that connect together. They call it compute subsystems.
While more companies are indeed making inroads into semiconductor design, the recent chip shortage exposed major concern over the fact that more than 90% of the world's chips are made in Asia. Now, China and the US are going back and forth imposing export controls on chip technologies, which could escalate to impact ARM's significant revenue that comes from China. In 2018, SoftBank broke off ARM's China business into an independent entity, ARM China, that's majority owned by a group of Chinese investors.
It's essentially to allow us to not only grow our business in China, which is our essentially base core business. We set up a distributor arm. But at the same time, we also created an R&D arm that allows an independent entity to develop products specifically for the China market. Some that are ARM-based, but some that are not ARM-based.
Haas says ARM has seen minimal impact from export controls so far.
China's a good market for us, about 20% of our business. It's shifted over the years. It used to be largely mobile phone-based. Now it's mostly around the data center and automotive.
But ARM China was also embroiled in controversy for years, with SoftBank and ARM trying to oust the CEO of the China business, Alan Wu. Despite being fired twice, Wu refused to leave until last year. Now, several former ARM China employees are starting a new internal chip design company in China with backing from Shenzhen's government. ARM's stock slid more than 5% on the news.
It's been very ugly and kind of messy and confusing. And now, of course, some of the people there have moved to start their own company. But again, a lot of Chinese companies have long-standing relationships with ARM, so the expectation is they're going to want to work there because, again, they have that huge base of software. If somebody creates a new architecture, they have to build the software, and that takes years and years and years.
In February, ARM China laid off about 100 employees. Meanwhile, rival architecture RISC-V is gaining traction in China as an alternative to US and Europe-based tech that could end up banned in China. Geopolitics aside, ARM also faces risk from the major slump in smartphone sales.
If they were still totally dependent on it, it would obviously not be great. But because they've diversified into these other areas, it gives them much more opportunity. That's why you see them focusing so much on things like Neoverse for servers, on autonomous driving with cars, and on these embedded devices. So that's where they see the future moving ahead.
We're not as impacted as folks might think, because one of the trends we've seen, particularly in smartphones, is more and more ARM processors that go into those phones. So for us, we've actually seen an increase in royalty per phone.
Labor is another market-wide headwind. The world's chip leader, TSMC, is blaming a shortage of skilled workers for delays at its $40 billion fab under construction in Arizona.
We had a shortage of talent, and now it's hard. It's hard for ARM. It's hard for our whole industry. There's no way that demand for semiconductors in the next 10 to 15 years will abate. It's only going to increase. So it's a pretty fierce talent war.
That's why ARM is helping launch a semiconductor education alliance to create new pathways for future talent pools, amid the increasing chip needs of generative AI and the growing list of companies like NVIDIA working on ARM-based processors.
What that's going to mean is increased demand for ARM technology everywhere in all those markets that I mentioned, and more compute capability, because every single AI application needs a CPU, every single one. You cannot do AI without a CPU, and stop.
We've got well over 400 acres here, and we are in fact in ballroom number 1. There will be 3 other factories, one to the north and 2 of them that are to the west of this.
There's a boom happening in Texas, and we're not talking about oil. America's second biggest state has become the hub for manufacturing the country's tiniest microchips.
That because we have ports, because we have access to materials, because of our low cost of doing business, we're best situated to lead this next generation of chip manufacturing.
The integrated circuit was invented at Texas Instruments more than 60 years ago. But it's Silicon Valley in California that's long held the title for, well, advancing technology on silicon. But as the cost of making smaller and smaller transistors has skyrocketed, so has the size of the machines and the amount of land needed to do it.
I mean, Texas is spacious, it's huge, and then it has great support for ease of business.
Now, manufacturing chips on U.S. soil is a growing priority amid mounting geopolitical tensions between China and Taiwan. The CHIPS Act set aside more than $52 billion for reshoring production. Samsung, Texas Instruments, Infineon, Global Wafers, NXP, Applied Materials, all these chip giants have ramped up operations in the Lone Star State. Apple and Amazon chose Texas for designing their custom chips too.
Tell me why we are wearing these things called bunny suits.
These beautiful bunny suits are to keep the product clean. So this is a Class 1 clean room. We change out all of the air every 8 seconds. So if you ever see an eyelash on a chip, it looks like a space monster.
We got a rare look inside the clean rooms of 3 huge chip fabrication plants, or fabs, around Texas, and took a tour of 2 more being built for a total of $47 billion in new investment coming to the state. While chip companies have made a flurry of big Texas expansions in the last couple years, the state's actually had ties to the semi-industry for more than 90 years, since the founding of Geophysical Service Incorporated, which 4 Dallas engineers reimagined in 1951, renaming it Texas Instruments. The transistor, the most basic building block of semiconductors, was invented 3 years earlier by a team led by William Shockley, a founding father of Silicon Valley. But it was Jack Kilby at Texas Instruments that first filed for a patent of the integrated circuit in 1958. This invention opened up the possibility of miniaturizing chips by creating the entire circuit, not just the transistors, out of silicon. TI went on to build the first handheld calculator in 1967, and it's still well known today for graphing calculators used in classrooms around the world.
It is very much so the calculator company to much of the world, but we are so much more than that, obviously. If you have an electronic device, you almost certainly have a TI semiconductor chip inside of it. So we have 80,000 products that ship out to 100,000 different customers. So whether it's analog, but maybe more importantly, think about anything that you can plug into a wall or that has a cord in it, very likely has a TI power management IC in it.
Kyle Flessner has been with TI for 30 years. He showed us around TI's R-Fab 2 in Richardson, just north of Dallas. With this second, bigger fab that came online in September, TI plans to output a combined 100 million analog chips per day at its 2 fabs in Richardson.
So this is our overhead delivery system. We've got about 15 miles of track between these 2 factories, and those cars can move as fast as 7.5 miles an hour.
And Flessner took us to the construction site of TI's $30 billion fab coming to the 45,000-person city of Sherman, 60 miles north of Dallas.
We're standing under the waffle table. That's what it's commonly called. So it's a clean room up top. The air comes through, the utilities come through that support all of that tool infrastructure.
Our fab uses only 300 millimeter or 12-inch and is fully automated.
Samsung is the state's other huge chip maker. The South Korean giant came to Texas in 1996, breaking ground on a big fab in Austin that's now fully devoted to foundry, making logic chips for outside customers. Samsung opened a second fab there in 2007.
Everything is supposed to be bigger and better in Texas.
Texas does indeed have plenty of land for the gigantic footprint of modern chip fabs. Now, Samsung is adding a whopping 1,200-acre new site in Taylor, 30 miles north of Austin, where it plans to make its first advanced chips in the U.S. starting next year.
Our customers love to come to Texas. It's equidistant from either coast, and we know that some of the world's most prominent fabless companies are actually in the United States. Bringing Taylor on board is just going to increase their ability to source their chips domestically and not have to go into areas of the world where they may have some discomfort.
Texas has long been famous for policies that entice new businesses. It's one of only a handful of states with no income tax. Combine that with sales tax exemptions for manufacturing machinery and a variety of other tax waivers, and it's no surprise that a number of major companies have relocated or built in Texas lately. There's Tesla's expanding Gigafactory in Austin, and major companies that relocated their headquarters to Texas recently include Caterpillar, Charles Schwab, Hewlett-Packard, and Oracle. Now, the chip industry has its own special set of incentives. In June, Abbott approved the Texas CHIPS Act, setting aside $1.4 billion to subsidize companies that manufacture in the state, as well as universities willing to build related R&D centers.
Texas ranks #1 in the United States for Tier 1 research universities. And within a 100-mile area of where Samsung is going to be located, they have access to so much incredible intellectual talent.
It's not hard to see why Abbott aims to keep Texas at the center of the national conversation about reshoring chip manufacturing. More than $500 billion worth of semiconductors were sold globally in 2022, and chips accounted for more than 300,000 jobs in the U.S. Chips are vital not only for powering our cars, phones, and computers, but for national security, from military communication systems to fighter jets and advanced weaponry. And when peaking demand during the pandemic coincided with supply chain disruptions, the resulting chip shortage made it abundantly clear how much the world relies on chips made in Asia. As of 2021, 92% of the world's most advanced chips were made in Taiwan by Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company. And China has repeatedly threatened to invade Taiwan, a move that could cut the U.S. off from the majority of advanced chips.
One thing that we learn with international hostilities, and that is we can't be relied upon hostile countries for our everyday needs. So the United States of America needs to make sure that we are manufacturing everything that we need. We learned that during the time of COVID, and we shall not make that mistake again.
Over the last 30-plus years, the U.S. share of global chip production has plummeted from 37% to just 12%. That's because it costs at least 20% more to build and operate a new fab in the U.S. than in Asia. Labor is cheaper there, the supply chain is more accessible, and government incentives are far greater. The CHIPS Act aims to change that, setting aside $52 billion for companies to manufacture in the U.S., and Texas hopes to get as much of those federal dollars as possible. Since the National CHIPS Act was introduced in 2020, more than 50 new semiconductor projects have been announced in the U.S., creating some 44,000 new jobs and totaling more than $210 billion of investment. More than $61 billion of that is happening in Texas, with 6 projects expected to create more than 8,000 jobs. The $17 billion Samsung fab we saw being built in Taylor is one of the 2 largest projects. But the biggest investment by far is the $30 billion Texas Instruments fab coming to Sherman.
For a city of 45,000, that's a huge investment in our community. Our entire city tax base was around $4 billion.
This particular space is about 370,000 square feet. So it's one of our largest, actually our largest wafer fab that we have in production.
But when it comes to new chip fab investments, Arizona has taken the lead, with a $20 billion fab coming from Intel and a $40 billion site from the world's top advanced chip maker, TSMC. Still, Texas is in close second, and it's the state with the highest number of chip fabs in the country. TI, for instance, has had another fab in Sherman since 1966.
Texas Instruments went a long way of putting Sherman on the map.
The support we've had from the state legislator and then also the federal support in this industry, Texas continues to be a hub for where we can build this manufacturing industry.
German-based Infineon Technologies is one of the world's biggest providers of automotive chips, and it makes many of them in Austin.
The number of chips in an automotive, in an EV, and automotive in general is drastically increasing, and all the connectivity, everything communicating within the car, around the car, is increasing the chip content in every vehicle.
Infineon has been in the U.S. for 25 years. In 2020, it expanded manufacturing in Texas when it bought Cypress Semiconductor for about $10 billion, taking over its Austin fab, where we got a tour.
So it's about 2 football fields in length, all the way from the front to the end, and it's close to 100,000 square feet of clean room space. That's because we're building so many chips at the same time. We have wafers in here that are the beginning of their multi-month life in this fab, and wafers that are about to ship out to back-end facilities.
Netherlands-based NXP Semiconductors also has 2 fabs in Austin and recently made plans for a $2.6 billion expansion that would add an additional 4-story fab. X-Fab, a chip company that's been in Texas for more than 2 decades, also recently announced a $200 million expansion of its silicon carbide fab in North Texas. As the world's second biggest maker of advanced chips, Samsung is a huge draw for other semiconductor suppliers to come to Texas, especially with its coming 1,200-acre advanced fab north of Austin.
When you start bringing in a fab like that, you need to build the ecosystem, and the supply chain is really important. And there's a lot of discussion these days about onshoring supply chains.
Of the $17 billion price tag for Samsung's Taylor fab, $11 billion is going to machinery and equipment. Similarly, TI told us the tools will account for at least 65% of its new fab costs in Sherman. Tools like the $200 million EUV lithography machines made by ASML, the only devices in the world that can etch with enough precision for the most advanced chips. ASML has offices in Dallas and Austin. And the tools made by Applied Materials, the world's next biggest provider of semiconductor equipment, in Austin since 1992.
We have been a part of the technology, high-tech ecosystem for more than 30 years in Austin. That's where our main workforce is, and we continue to grow. And also recently we announced we are going to further expand in Austin, Texas.
How helpful is it that some of those tool companies like Applied Materials have facilities here in Texas?
I think it's absolutely critical. They have their expertise that is here should we identify a problem. Having that on site in hours rather than days is a huge benefit to the efficiency of our operations.
As TI expands in Sherman, there's another big supplier expanding manufacturing there too. Taiwan-based Global Wafers, through its US-based subsidiary Globotech, is spending $5 billion to build the country's biggest silicon wafer factory, the base disks that chips are made on.
The wafers are actually sawed out of this ingot and polished, and ultimately end up being this bare silicon wafer.
They were looking to build the first plant of its kind to be built in America in 20 years. So we were in competition with Ohio and South Korea to bring that plant to Sherman.
When it comes to why Global Wafers and Texas Instruments chose Sherman, water was a major factor.
And what you see behind us, that is a process cooling water line that is used to cool the tools as they're operating.
It takes a lot of water to make chips, right?
It does take quite a bit of water, but it'll probably be somewhere between 1,700 and 2,500 gallons per minute.
Previous councils and mayors have bought water rights at Lake Texoma, one of our largest inland lakes in America. So we have plenty of water, which is gold currency.
But water isn't plentiful in all parts of Texas. About a quarter of the state remains in drought. Where will that water come from here, especially in periods of drought?
So we have the Texas Water Board that's working on that, and legislation we're working on this session to make sure that with a growing population in Texas, we will be able to provide for the water needs, not just of businesses, but also for our growing population.
In 2021, Samsung used about 38 billion gallons of water to make its chips.
Now what you see here are the cooling towers behind us. And we've got a very aggressive goal this year in Austin, on our Austin campus. We want to reuse over 1 billion gallons of water this year.
This factory will be twice as efficient in reuse and recycling than our existing facilities that are in production.
Flessner says the 300mm wafer size being made in Richardson and Sherman will help.
We can produce 2.3 times the number of chips on this wafer, and yet it only costs us fractionally more to manufacture. But also it's better for the environment because there is less waste, and our electricity and water usage per chip is substantially improved in the 300mm form factor.
Making chips also takes a massive amount of power. Each of those advanced chip etching EUV machines that Samsung will use in Taylor is rated to consume about 1 megawatt of electricity, 10% more than the previous generation. One study showed Samsung used more than 20% of South Korea's entire solar and wind power capacity in 2020.
So behind me is our natural gas powered power plant that's 750 megawatts. So we're feeding, a good percentage of the grid for Texas. So we've got power and water. When you have those two things, then you're already ahead of most other communities, nationwide.
But Texas also has a uniquely independent grid that largely cuts it off from borrowing power across state lines.
In Denton, Texas, where the winter storm and power crisis continues this afternoon, outages
are ongoing as low temperatures.
In 2021, that grid failed during an extreme winter storm, leaving millions of Texans without power and causing at least 57 deaths. We asked Governor Abbott about grid reliability in the face of mounting needs.
I already signed 12 laws to make the power grid more reliable, more resilient, and more secure. And so we can definitely assure any business moving here they will have access to the power they need, but also at a low cost.
Samsung, Infineon, and NXP were forced to shut down their Austin fabs temporarily during the blackout in February 2021. Infineon told investors output levels wouldn't return to normal until June that year. Now, Samsung, Infineon, and other chip companies have switched entirely to renewable power.
This site is on 100% green power, and that's sourced from wind farms here in Texas. We're also able to recycle the majority of the water we use on site.
In addition to resource challenges, chips are also facing hard times right now when it comes to sales, amid a broader downturn for tech and an overabundance of inventory in the wake of the chip shortage. Intel, the third biggest advanced chip maker after TSMC and Samsung, aims to cut costs by up to $10 billion over the next 3 years. In Texas, it's selling its 61-acre Austin research hub. Samsung, meanwhile, reported dismal Q1 earnings in April and cut production of memory chips in response to falling prices. But it's doubled down on the foundry side of its business, making logic chips in Texas, where Samsung hinted to CNBC it will be expanding beyond the first fab announced in Taylor.
$17 billion investment on that site as a first factory, but we have 1,200 acres, and that first factory is taking up about 250 acres of it, so we have room to expand.
And early this year, Texas Instruments suffered its first sales decline since 2020, but that hasn't slowed down its fab expansion in Texas.
We're in the relatively early stages, but we are making tremendous progress towards having production out of this facility in 2025.